Welcome, everybody, to the Banyan Books podcast. My name is Ross McKeechee, and today we'll be in conversation with Merlin Sheldrake. I'll give a full introduction on him in a moment. First, I'll just make a couple of announcements. First, I'd like to acknowledge that Banyan Books and Sound is located in Kitsilano in Vancouver, which is on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Also, it's Banyan Books' 50th anniversary year this year, so that's 50 years as an independent bookstore. Now, Banyan has got regular opening hours again, 11 to 7 every day. And if you're not located in Vancouver, you can go to our website, banyan.com, BANYEN.com. You can order all of our books and products by mail order anywhere in the world. So please support your local independent bookstores like Banyan Books. Now for the introduction of our esteemed guest. Merlin Sheldrake is a biologist and writer with a background in plant sciences, microbiology, ecology, the history and philosophy of science. He has a PhD in tropical ecology from Cambridge University for his work on underground fungal networks in tropical forests in Panama, where he was a pre-doctoral research fellow of the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. His research ranges from fungal biology to the history of Amazonian ethnobotany to the relationship between sound and form in resonant systems. He is a keen brewer and fermenter, and is fascinated by the relationships that arise between humans and what he calls more than human organisms. Today, we'll be speaking about his first book, which is titled Entangled Life: How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures. Merlin is a really beautiful storyteller, and he skillfully weaves a poetic blend of hard science and mystic expansiveness. More than anything, he opens our minds to new ways of perceiving and understanding. He helps us to fall in love not just with fungi, but with the whole interrelated web of life and nature. Please join me in welcoming Merlin Sheldrake. Merlin, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
I understand you have a nice connection with the west coast of BC.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I learned to walk in BC, in fact, and I've spent my summers there since I was a baby. So it's a regular place for me.
Wonderful. So this is your first book, and hopefully not the last. I'm very curious, where did the journey begin for you with writing this book?
Well, I think it had been building for a while, and my interest in the fungal world had only deepened the more that I studied these organisms. They're such interconnected organisms, you can't really think about these fungal networks without thinking about who they're connected to and where they happen to be. And once you start thinking about who they're connected to and where they happen to be, then you just, the questions never end. And so my ever deepening fascination with the fungal world had been building through my time doing research into mycorrhizal fungal networks in tropical forests. And then at a certain point, it felt like the book kind of found me. Someone asked if I wanted to write a book, and I wasn't sure. And then someone else suggested it, and I said, well, maybe. And then it just started to happen. It became clear that this was what needed to occur. So it arose in my life.
Yes. Wonderful. I'm glad you answered that call, and I really benefited from reading this book. I'm really curious, just your background and how you came to where you are today in your work. What your formative years were like. How did you become who you are, and what were your influences?
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Well, My father's a biologist and a very amazing student of the living world, and so I grew up with a very curious human, guiding my development and encouraging all sorts of curiosity as well with the living world. So that's has played a very big part in my interest in biology and my subsequent study of biology. And so, um, yeah, that's a big part of it. And it's one of these things where you start thinking about the living world, you start thinking about how things connect. And as I said, these fungi are connected organisms. And so when you start thinking about ecology and the ways that organisms relate to other organisms and to their environment, these connections that form between organisms, whether it be fleeting moments of contact or more sustained, intimate association, that fungi can really help us to understand this ecological principle because they form these enduring links between organisms. And so it was a very natural step for me to fall down the fungal rabbit hole because I was already interested in the ways that organisms live and the way that they behave and the way that they relate.
A rabbit hole indeed. My impression in reading the book was that there is almost, it seems like there's possibly endless things to learn about fungus and mycelial networks. And um, like your book does an amazing job of opening the doorway of curiosity, that but you're very clear that this is a young science that's received little attention. Can you speak a little bit to that and where mycology is at in its stages of growth?
Mm. Yeah, so within modern Western science, mycology has been neglected because for a number of reasons. I think partly the most basic level is that most fungi live most of their lives out of our sight, out of the reach of our immediate senses, as mycelial networks embedded in their environments. And so there's just a lack of access, and what we can't see, what we can't touch, then it's hard for us to study and take an interest. And so I think the ephemerality of mushrooms as well has led to all sorts of more complex attitudes, like ranging from fear to delight. But it's hard to understand an organism just from looking at the mushrooms. Imagine what you'd know about an apple tree just by looking at the apples that came out on its branches for a few weeks every year. There'd be a lot that we would be missing, and it's just like that with fungi. And so modern technologies have allowed us to open up the microbial world and the fungal world, like DNA sequencing, new types of microscopy. And so there's a sort of a new wave of interest in these organisms because we just know more about them. We know that there is more to know. And so apart from that, in the 60s, fungi won their independence, taxonomically speaking, and were then deemed to be an entire kingdom of life rather than a corner of the plant kingdom. And that meant that a commensurate amount of interest could be devoted to them. It's still not yet happened. They're still neglected relative to the plant and animal sciences. But it once you recognize that this is a whole kingdom of life, it then deserves a kingdom's worth of attention. And so that's really helped things to transform. And but of course, interest in fungi has gone back a very long time. Many organisms eat mushrooms, and our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have paid a lot of attention to their surroundings and have a very sophisticated knowledge of their ambient vegetation and their ambient fungal the ambient fungi and the ambient animals, and so there's a lot of evidence that humans knew of or used mushrooms as medicines and as foods, and going into deep antiquity and long before. So this is our relationship with these organisms is by no means new, but we are now able to ask new questions.
Right, right. And there's a whole history around human relationship with it and the different uses, which we can get into a bit more. If I might just share a quote from your book to just help our audience get an understanding of just what a profound impact they have on our lives. So the quote says, "Today, more than 90% of all plant species depend on mycorrhizal fungi. They are the rule, not the exception, a more fundamental part of planthood than fruit, flowers, leaves, wood, or even roots. Out of this intimate partnership, complete with cooperation, conflict, and competition, plants and mycorrhizal fungi enact a collective flourishing that underpins our past, present, and future. We are unthinkable without them, yet seldom do we think about them. The cost of our neglect has never been more apparent. It is an attitude we can't afford to sustain." So before getting into the sort of implications of our wrong attitude about these things, can you just tell us a bit about the origins of life on land and how it moved out of the ocean and how fungi played a role in that?
So around 500 million years ago, the ancestors of land plants started to make a transition out of freshwater habitats into the open air. And there was very little life on the surface of the earth in the terrestrial environment at that point. It was scorched and barren and seared by radiation, unshaded, unprotected by all the organisms that currently live on the surface of the land. And so there are a lot of challenges to life on land. And especially if you spent your life as an alga floating around in a nutrient broth, you don't have to reach or search to get your food. You eat light. But otherwise, the minerals that you need just you can absorb from your surroundings. But when you start washing up on the soggy shores of lakes and rivers, there's an entirely new set of challenges. And one of those challenges is how do you get the water and the nutrients you need to survive to supplement your photosynthetic capacity? How do you acquire these things from the solid ground when you have nothing like a root? And so this is where fungi kicked in. And they were either on land before these algae arrived or washed up with them, but either way, fungi are very well equipped to explore solid environments. That's what they've evolved to do. And so in these earliest days, they struck up an alliance where the fungi could explore the ground and forage for nutrients and water in exchange for these energy-containing carbon compounds that the plants, the algae, were producing in photosynthesis. And so for the first 60 million years or so of early land plant evolution, fungi were the roots of plants. This was before roots. And so roots followed fungi into being and ended up playing a role very much like these earliest mycorrhizal partners did. And so this has gone on all the way till today. And so today, all plants have fungi that live in their leaves and in their shoots, winding between their cells, and also in their roots. 90% of plants depend on these root fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, mycofungus and rhiza root. And so what we see now is the outcome of this ancient alliance. These are they are so intimately embedded in each other's lives that it's hard to think of them as a separate point. And you hold a plant, you're holding the outcome, the outgrowth of this association. And it really changes the way that we think about ecosystems, because these beings, these plants that we see and depend on for all the things that we depend on them for, are living relationships.
You use the term promiscuous a few times in the book to describe the relationships of mycelial networks and plants. Why that word? Can you give us an understanding of that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so plants don't inherit their fungal partners. They must reform this association when they start growing their roots. And fungi must find a plant partner as well when they germinate from their spores. And so this forming and reforming of the relationship continually takes place. And plants are able to form relationships with many different types of fungi, mycorrhizal fungus. and mycorrhizal fungi can form relationships with different plants. And so what you end up with is these overlapping shared fungal networks. And this is the concept of the wood wide web, as it's sometimes affectionately known. And so plants become essentially socially networked by fungi. They become connected through this fungal matrix in the soil. And so I use promiscuity to refer to the fact that these plants are able to form multiple types of partnership, as are these fungi.
Right. This wood wide web concept and the living, shifting interchange and exchange between all of these living beings in these networks. You shine a light on how that can help us with understanding human networks and other networks that we create models for, including how our universe is laid out. You easily go from the micro, what's happening in the microscopic world, into the macro, the intergalactic universal world in this book. Um, I guess my question is, how can these mycelial networks help us understand broader networks in our lives?
Yeah, I think there are lots of different ways to think about this question. And one of them is, if you look at the way that fungal networks grow and explore, a lot of this work has been done with wood rotting fungi that range over large distances and form long-lived networks. And so they have a greater need for coordinating themselves as they sprawl. Some fungal networks are very small, like moles they form these ephemeral puffs that don't really range beyond their source of food. So, but these wood rotting networks, they if you study their behavior, you can see how they work. So Lynn Boddy is a researcher in England who's done a lot of work on this. And one of the experiments she does is she takes a block of wood, which has a wood rotting fungus living in it, and she puts that on a dish. And you can watch the fungus exploring outwards from the block of wood. It forms a kind of circle as it grows outwards in all directions at once. If we were in a desert looking for water, we'd have to choose one direction. And fungi can go in all directions at once. And so that's what they do. They spread outwards, seeping outwards on this dish. And then when they encounter a new block of wood, then the behavior of the network changes and it strengthens the connections with the new block of wood, and it starts to withdraw the exploratory connections that aren't connected to any new blocks of wood. And so you can think about it a bit like Darwinian selection. The stronger links, the fitter links are thickened and reinforced, and the less fit links, the ones that don't no longer do anything, those can be retracted and pruned back. So you have this very fluid behavior. These networks are always shifting their shape and in response to their circumstances. And of course they have to, because if they pour themselves into their environment for a living, which is what these fungi are doing, then the environment is always a different shape, a different form. You have to be a shapeshifter. You have to be flexible and responsive to your surroundings. And so this fluid network formation is a very powerful capability and a very ancient capability. And so you can see in these networks both an ability to shift, to change, to prune, to thicken, but also you see redundancy. So there are all these interconnections. So if you sever one part of a network, then almost always there's other strands of the network that can take up that slack. Right. And so these networks tend to be very robust. So if you then compare that to some of those human networks, if the coronavirus pandemic has revealed some of these fragilities in our supply lines, for example, when you have very centralized networks with just 5 major food providers, and if you knock them out, then the whole thing comes to grinding to a halt. But contrast that with some more local system of food production and distribution, which is much more robust. You could knock out lots of those links in that network and still have a functioning network. So one way that we can learn from fungal networks is thinking about the robustness and these resilience of these networks and how tolerant to damage they are. And when we do that, we'd see actually as is being revealed, how fragile many of the systems that we've made are, how fragile many of these human-made networks are. So that's one way of doing it. There are many others. You can use fungal networks to model network behavior. You can sever a link in a fungal network. It'd be easier than shutting a road to see what happens to the traffic flow. You can easily cut a link in a fungal network. So people are working out how to use these living networks as ways to simulate network behavior and incorporate these principles into design of cities and transport networks.
Right. One of the things that really fascinates me is um, contemplating the fact that there's no central. Of course, in human beings, we look at the brain as the central processing plant for our intelligence within our internal system. For these mycelial networks, they're each piece of the whole network is the center really of intelligence. You can remove one and the memories, like they're constant, there's a communication happening between them. I'm not doing it justice. Can you expand on that idea?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we're so used to looking for centers of operation. We're used to having a center of operations of whether it be our heart or which is the center of our circulatory system, or our head, which is the center of our nervous system. And so, and we build our structures like this. We build capital cities. We have heads of state. We have a very cerebrocentric, human-centric way of organizing our some of our structures. We also have more decentralized ways of organizing too. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but nonetheless, you do see these centralizing tendencies showing up in the way that we structure our societies. And so it's hard for us to look at organisms that don't have brains and yet are able to solve problems. They're able to regulate the behavior in sophisticated ways. And we look for a where because we're used to looking for a where, but with the fungal network, it doesn't really get you very far because there's many of everything. And so coordination of their networks takes place both everywhere at once and nowhere in particular. And it's a real riddle. People are working this out. The researchers have been studying how is it that they can coordinate their behavior? How is it that one part of a network can behave in a certain way, taking into account what is happening in all these other parts of a network? Where is this data being sensory data? Fungal networks are sensitive to temperature, light, gravity, chemicals, many more. And they somehow can integrate these data streams, integrate sensing and perception with action. And how can they do that? And where do they do that? And so these are really big questions in fungal biology right now. And it seems that they're able to do that in a distributed way. So each growing tip of a fungal cell called a hypha seems to be able to integrate information from many different parts of the network. And so this integration is happening on a very parallel basis, a massive parallel integration. And it's helpful for us in understanding the living world because it helps to decenter our narratives, helps us to become more sensitive to the variety of ways that organisms have evolved to solve problems, to learn, to remember, and to make decisions. And of course, when you think about it, would make no sense for a fungus or a plant, for that matter. The plants are also very decentralized organisms, to have a brain. I mean, plants can. You can buy a herbivore can bite off 90% of a plant and it can grow back and regenerate from what remains. If you have a head where you've put all your most precious, treasured cognitive faculties and you lose that with one bite of a herbivore, then you're screwed, and it would be a ludicrous way to organize yourself. So in fact, brains don't make sense for these organisms, and we wouldn't expect them to have brains. And we have brains because we move around. We need to have these networks of neurons that make up our brain in a neat, concentrated place, like packed up in a suitcase, that allows us to roam and to rove. And so, yeah, so I think just thinking on these questions really helps us to broaden our perspectives.
It actually does. I found it does shift. There is something that changes in you as you read this book because of the ways that you ask us to start looking at the world and the questions that you ask us to start asking. you're not giving hard and fast answers, but can you talk a little bit about the importance of removing our anthropocentric or human-centered outlook when we're observing natural phenomena, and how that can change us as human beings or evolve us even as human beings?
Yeah, well, classical definitions of intelligence and cognition have really put humans at the top of a kind of league table, a great chain of intelligence that uses us and the way that we perceive the world as a yardstick by which to judge all other organisms, as if we were this ultimate type case, um, the highest standard. But when we do that, when we judge organisms by our standards, then we can forget um, to appreciate these organisms on their own terms. Darwin had a definition, a very pragmatic, I think, a very helpful definition of intelligence, where he sort of intelligence as the ability of an organism to do the things that it needed to do in order to survive. And it's a very helpful definition, I think, because it encourages us to think about the needs and the cognitive demands of that organism in its environment over the course of its life and in the context of its evolutionary story. What does it need to do to survive, and how good is it at doing that? And that way we can immediately migrate to its terms, to its context, and we don't start to apply our own standards, which can distort our ability to perceive and to make sense of the world. So I think part of it is about helping us to understand the living world, and part of it feels just like manners, just good manners. And I think there's an attitude shift that can happen as we start to decenter ourselves, to dissolve these human exceptionalist narratives. And I think this can help to reframe and help us to reimagine our relationships to the living world, which is something that we so urgently need to do at this moment, because our current attitudes are dysfunctional, and not sustainable, and ecocidal and genocidal.
Yeah, yeah. I like that term, ecocidal. Um, I don't like the attitude. I like the word.
Mm.
Now, aside from how mushrooms can change the way that we perceive the world, uh, how can they be used? Sorry, I shouldn't say mushrooms, but fungi. Mushrooms are simply the fruit, the fruiting bodies. I learned. How can fungi actually provide us with tangible solutions? That now there are many ways. What are some of the most exciting ways that fungi are being used?
Mm. So this again is an old story, and people who've been using mushrooms as food and medicine for many thousands of years. And so um, this is a big deal. And using fungi in fermentation, whether as yeast and production of alcohol, which has a very long and intimate relationship with human cultures and human cultural evolution, and or as foods like miso, which use a fungus to digest grains, beans. And so we've been recruiting fungi to break things down for us for a long time. You can think about these processes as a kind of externalized metabolism. We can't digest these things ourselves in this way, so we recruit a fungus to help us do so. Other organisms do this too. Leafcutter ants and termites cultivate fungi in huge in fungus combs within their enormous mounds, and they feed the fungus, and the fungus then feeds them. And they're like giant prosthetic guts, externalized guts. And we do this similar thing. When we recruit a fungus to break down the sugar in a barrel of grape juice and turn it into alcohol, it's a kind of externalized metabolism. And that's same with the misos and other fungal foods. So by extension, right now, there are new ways to think about recruiting fungi to break things down for us. I guess whenever you have made compost, anyone who's made compost, anyone who's has rotted organic matter and done, used that to nourish the soil and to develop soil structure, and as has been happening for a long time, we've been recruiting these fungi to break things down for us in the environment. But now The field of microremediation is an example of getting fungi to help us, encouraging fungi to help us break down poisonous materials, chemicals, pollutants, waste that we have pushed into the environment. So fungi have amazing abilities metabolically. They're kind of metabolic wizards. They can break down things from crude oil to use cigarette butts. They can sequester heavy metals. Very ingenious metabolic creatures. And so there are a number of ways that they might help us with environmental cleanup. So whether it be putting in blocks of mycelium into heavy metal contaminated water, then removing the blocks of mycelium with the heavy metals attached to them and disposing of that safely, or rerouting our waste streams. So there's one company called Mycocycle which are doing this and rerouting the asphalt roofing waste streams. So rather than dump asphalt roofing in landfills, where they make up a significant proportion of landfill waste, to take that material into some kind of fungal processing plant, I encourage these fungi to break down this material into its more usable or more disposable constituent parts, and then send those parts off on their way to different parts of the waste stream. So there's a number of ways that this fungal metabolism is, can be helpful in rethinking our philosophy of waste. That's just one example. There are so many.
Yeah, there's so many. I understand that. I was really curious about the idea that in microremediation, these beings can actually be trained to feed on different things. Like you used the example of the cigarette butts, and you gave an example in the book of was it Peter McCoy that trained them to eat the cigarette butts? How did he do that?
So yeah, so Peter McCoy, who started an organization called Radical Mycology, and he wrote a book called Radical Mycology, and he's a great fungal thinker and activist. And so he trained this fungus, a pleurotus fungus, with the ones that produce oyster mushrooms, and he started by growing them on with unused cigarette butts, and then with just a few used cigarette butts, but also with another source of food. So they didn't have to depend entirely on these, on the cigarette butts as a source of energy. And then he gradually increased the proportion of their food that was a proportion of their matrix, of their substrate, which was cigarette butts, used cigarette butts. And over time, they had to adapt to a larger and larger proportion of cigarette butts in their environment. In the end, they were growing just on nothing but used cigarette butts, and were able to break down these compounds and use this as their sole source of energy.
Wow. Wow. So, I mean, anybody who's thinking that might be just a random experiment, cigarette butts make up a huge amount of the waste produced on our planet every year. I can't remember the number. I don't know if you do, but there's a massive number of cigarette butts that are being thrown into landfills every year. Okay. I think we have to talk about psilocybin mushrooms, of course, because that's exciting for everybody. Can you tell us a little bit about the various ways that psilocybin, to start with, was used in history?
So it's a much discussed and contested history because there isn't a huge amount of evidence. Mushrooms don't leave good evidence. They don't form, they tend to rot very quickly and very easily and leave not much behind. So the most well-documented history is in Central America. And there are texts, pre-Columbian codices depicting deities holding mushrooms and consuming mushrooms, and a number of Spanish colonizers documented mushroom use and in Mexico, what is present-day Mexico, in the 15th century. And these cultures would use them for various reasons, but they were very much a part of their life, and they were venerated. And so there are mushroom stones, these stones that look like mushrooms that date from 2000 BC. So it seems that mushroom use in Central America stretches back quite a long way. And in other parts of the world, it's less clear. There aren't knockdown, undisputed piece of evidence about mushroom use in Europe, for example. There's a lot of speculation about certain mushroom-like forms on, say, the doors of churches or in paintings on church walls. Whether these are mushrooms or not is, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, and it's very hard to know for sure. So whether mushrooms played a part in more ancient rites, the Eleusinian mysteries, there's a lot of speculation about what was this drink, this kykeon that initiates would drink and then experience, have a profound, transformative mystical experience, which they would never be able to speak of. And what was in that drink? Again, a sort of much speculation. Some people suggest ergot fungi, from which LSD was originally derived. Some suggest psilocybin mushrooms. And again, it's hard to know either way. But certainly psychoactive plants and psychoactive substances have been used by humanity for a very long time and are actually used by other organisms as well. Animals get high in a number of different ways. So we're not alone in our quest for altered states.
Which animals, I'm curious, which animals use psilocybin?
Well, I don't know of any animals that use psilocybin, but other animals use, lemurs lick millipedes to get high, moths drink the nectar of psychoactive flowers, robins eat certain berries that get them high, kind of drunk, kind of high. And there's a long list.
They're so cute.
And yeah. so yeah, but certainly since the mid-20th century, when psilocybin mushrooms were reported and described by Western investigators in Mexico, these mushrooms have awareness of these mushrooms has grown incredibly fast. And now, what was perhaps practiced by a few people in the hills of Mexico have now become a global phenomenon. And within just a few years, by the early 70s, by the mid 70s, mushroom hunting had become a huge, as Paul Stamets says, a national obsession in North America and then later in England. And now over 200 species of psilocybin-producing mushrooms have been discovered, and people are domesticating them, growing them in warehouses, on their windowsills, in cupboards, all around the world. So there's really a new story of domestication going on right now with these mushrooms, which had fallen into a very easy step with humans who are lured by the promise of this altered state.
Now, how are these altered states being used in the healing arts with mental health and other various ailments?
So there's a new wave of research that's been taking place, as many people will know, in the last 20 years or so, which picks up the research which took place in the 1950s and 60s before these substances were made illegal, when many researchers and psychotherapists, psychologists came to regard psychedelics, LSD and psilocybin, mescaline, as wonder drugs that could help treat a whole range of disorders. And so, of course, modern science is catching up with indigenous knowledge of these plants and organisms which have been used in traditional cultures for a very long time, an unknowably long time. So it's not like the fact that modern science can now tell us that these things are medicinal for some things, that they can help us to grow and develop. This is not actually news. What is news is the techniques which are being used to describe these experiences, for example, modern brain scanning. And so there's a new perspective on these substances and what they're doing to our bodies. So the recent research with psilocybin has found that it seems to shut down a reducing valve in our consciousness.
Mm.
That when the psilocybin, it opens up new paths of cerebral connection and loosens the rigid habits of our thoughts, which is why it can be so useful for alleviating anxiety in the face of terminal diagnoses, or the rigid pessimism of depression or addiction. By freeing up new, by softening the rigid habits of our minds, by opening up these new possibilities for connections in our minds and in our brains, it's possible for people to explore new ways of behaving, and to step out of old ways of behaving. And so this is really where a lot of the attention is being directed right now.
Now, you're a scientist and you're very careful in your book not to make any big assumptions or extrapolate too far beyond the confines of what is proven and known. But since it's Banyan Books and it's kind of a mystic store, I wonder if you might extrapolate a little bit. What are your thoughts on the idea that these psychoactive plants, specifically mushrooms in this case, are helping human beings evolve our consciousness? What are your thoughts on that in terms of, do they have an intelligence that is trying to help us understand something larger?
It's a big question. And many people report in these mystical experiences that they have on psychedelics and in clinical environments, a sense of connection with some kind of beyond, a sense of the divine which exists out there, and a feeling of a deep connection with this divine. And even if they held rigidly materialistic or atheist views, can be convinced that there is actually something more than this material reality that we are asked to believe by mainstream science as the totality of existence. So it's very hard to deny one's own experience of these connections and these realms. And so it seems clear that these substances can help us to explore the nature of human consciousness, which is not something that we have very clearly worked out, at least within modern Western science. And so as tools to explore the possibilities of consciousness, to explore the expanse of our minds, to explore the nature of our minds and how they work and how they connect us with the world around us, the universe around us, these are really powerful tools. Whether or not the fungi are reaching out to humanity using these molecules to try and encourage us to rein in our destructive tendencies, I don't know. It's very hard to know. It's just very hard to know whether that's going on. I can see that it makes organisms fall into evolutionary step with other organisms all the time. The recent story of magic mushrooms is a good example. This new story of domestication has happened very quickly over the course of the last few decades. Psilocybin was first produced, it's thought, around 75 million years ago, long before humans arose. So if there was some kind of fungal intention to reach out to humans, then they certainly arrived quite a lot. They arrived early to the party. And so it's hard to make the case that psilocybin arose or evolved as some kind of intentional way to do this, because if it did so, then why would it have evolved so many millions of years before humans? And so yeah, it's just very hard to know. But it's just the main thing is how vivid these altered experiences are, that we are that we encouraged to feel these things. This feels to me like the indisputable, the place that, no matter how much of a skeptic you are about some of these more colorful speculations, the effects of these substances on people's minds is real, for sure. And the astonishing things that it can induce people to experience, these are real. Whether or not the speculations have a grounding in the long evolutionary story of these fungi that produce psilocybin.
Right. What role does in science does it, or I should say, how important is it for science to embrace both empirical evidence and the evidence that ancient cultures already understood, which is subjective direct experience, and that integration?
Well, I think it's very important to try and bring these realms together. And we live in quite a bifurcated system. It was bifurcated by Galileo and then subsequently reinforced by scientists over the centuries, separating the world, the objectively knowable world, Galileo called the world of primary qualities, things like mass, length, these quantifiable features of the world, the world that you can measure. And the secondary qualities like taste, color, these things which are outcomes of our senses, these things which are to do with subjectivity. So in he bracketed the subjective world off from the objective world because the subject world wasn't amenable to investigation by empirical experiment using techniques of measurement. And so science has proceeded on the basis of these primary qualities of this objectively knowable, objectively measurable parts of the world, but then it leaves quite a lot unexamined because obviously our subjective lives are a big part of our experience. That's what makes up our culture, our relationships, our personalities, our emotions, all these things which are these are our subjective worlds, the worlds that we experience as conscious beings from the inside. These are unreachable to these tools of science, which is why in these psychedelic studies, you have to do to quantify people's experiences. You get given these questionnaires like, how do you rate your experience of infinity on a scale of 1 to 5? I mean, this is how the empirical method has to try and approach this question of people's experience, and it's convoluted and complicated and actually really funny often. And so to live in a world where science can understand this objective, so-called objective reality, and not explain this subjective reality, leaves us with a kind of schism, a bifurcation between subject and object, between nature and culture. And these dualities are really causing us a lot of problems. And so some kind of unification, I think, is really important. And we're seeing the struggle that this duality brings in this study of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness. We're asked to believe that out of purposeless, meaningless, feelingless matter arises through a complicated process of evolution and through the convolutions of our nervous systems, arises our rich, lived, nuanced experience, our loves, our the experience of beauty, all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so how can meaningless, purposeless, feelingless substrate give rise to a meaningful, purposeful, feelingful existence? This is the hard problem of consciousness. It's an anomalous thing in the context of a meaningless, purposeless, feelingless universe. And so we're starting to see this kind of this wrestling, this grappling with the problem of this bifurcated world within consciousness studies. And that's that's a place where you can feel this fault line and the trouble and traumas of this fault line very clearly right now. And so, yeah, some kind of unification of these things is going to be required. Otherwise, we're going to live in this this split way, and it's I don't think it's healthy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You touch on this need to integrate these paradoxes in a lot of different ways in your book. And yes, folks, the study of fungi and mycelial networks can lead us into contemplating consciousness itself. It's time now to get on to some audience questions. So I will just open up the Q&A tab here. Everybody, the Q&A button, I saw someone had put in a question, is down at the bottom if you're on a laptop or computer, and I'm not sure where it is on the phone, but I'm sure Jacob can type that in the chat. Okay, first question here is from Ian. He says, I understand that tilling soil in large-scale agriculture is counterproductive as it destroys the fungal networks. Is there a way to keep the networks without harming yields?
This is an area of much exploration right now. It is very possible to do no-till agriculture. You drill the seeds in a way that is minimally disturbing to the soil. The challenge is when you want to, if you have a cover crop on the field beforehand, you've got to somehow kill that cover crop before you plant your crop. And how do you do that? And there are a number of ways to deal with that. It's a little tricky. Some people use herbicides, some people use finely controlled grazing to do that, to trample the crops before you drill in the seeds. But it's, yeah, the ploughing is a huge disruption, and doing that, it's a sort of chronic stress on these soil communities, very rich soil communities that are disrupted, continuously disrupted. And after years of that, after decades of that, you impoverish these the microbiome of the soil, which is, you can think of as the guts of the planet. You know, so it's definitely, no-till agriculture is a growing growing movement, and is definitely going to be increasingly important as we try to keep carbon in soils and to reimagine the way that we cultivate.
Mm-hmm. And something you touch on in the book is you're calling amateur mycologists. There's a huge grassroots movement of people that are out exploring the world of mycology and doing experiments. So Mendel says, "Hi, Merlin. Thank you for the fantastic book and for taking the time for this conversation. As you discussed, it has been a historical tendency to try to map human familiarities onto these very dissimilar bodies, rather than trying to perceive them on their own terms. I'm very interested in sense modalities, and I'm curious what perceptual systems you see in fungi that either A, lack human analogs, or B, can inform new ways to think about our human senses." Quite a bit to that question.
Mm-hmm. So there are a number of different ways that fungi sense, and of course there are lots of ways to be a fungus. It's a whole kingdom of life. So to speak in these generalities is to be a little inaccurate, but because not all fungi will perceive all of these things at all times. But broadly speaking, fungi can perceive pressure, temperature, pH, a very amazing ability to sense their chemical environments and to interact with their environments in a chemical way. This is maybe them where they have a lot of degrees of freedom here, for sure, because they digest their environment by producing chemicals, and they then absorb those chemicals into their environments, and they manage their lives, regulate the behavior using chemicals of all sorts. So the chemical sense, I think, is very developed. You can think of that as analogous to our olfaction, except that rather than have a small membrane, chemically sensitive membrane up and behind the nose, as we do, their entire body is a large chemically sensitive membrane. Gravity and so I think the way to think about the analog, the comparison with humans, is to think about the ways that this sensing takes place in our bodies. Our sensing tends to take place in these very localized sense organs, like our nose, our ears, our eyes, and fungi don't have such centralized sense organs. As we've discussed, they don't have centralized anything really, and so you can think about their sensing as taking place again everywhere at once, or there are centers of sensing depending on what type of sensing, but it's a very much a more distributed model. So this is how it's, if you think about them being bathed in a field of sensory information all the time, and then these data streams, sensory streams of sensory data flowing through these networks and somehow being integrated. It's a kind of mind-bending process. So that's how I think about these analogs. It takes me straight back to that decentralization question.
Mm-hmm. Now, the next question is from Amy. She says, lots of human attempts to control ecosystems have ended up with damaging unintended consequences. For example, bringing predators into an ecosystem to try and get rid of a so-called pest species. Do you anticipate any dangers from our increasing use of fungus as large-scale tools?
Yes, there are plenty of possible dangers. There's a growing market for a mycorrhizal inoculum that you can use to put on your plant's roots before you plant the plant. And it's a bit like the market for human probiotics right now. On the whole, what's being sold, the types of bacteria being sold in these human probiotic supplements aren't the A-listers or B-listers in your gut. They're sort of X, Y, and Z listers in your gut, which is just very easy to culture and produce in manufacturing facilities. And so it's a bit like that with these mycorrhizal supplements. What you're getting is, there are many ways to be a mycorrhizal fungus. And if you're just having some generic inoculum and you're just liberally applying it to your environment, first of all, it might not work because plants and mycorrhizal fungi have this quite sophisticated, they're ecologically matched. Different fungi have different effects on different plants in different places. And so not only might this inoculum not work, but you might be introducing these kind of weedy fungal species into environments where they weren't before. So you might actually start to cause some damage through these introductions through simply out of ignorance. We're just, when you're applying these things, many people don't know what they would expect to find in a healthy part of this ecosystem. So they don't know what they're trying to restore it to. So just applying this generic inoculum ignorantly to the environment is potentially very damaging. And we might not even know that we're causing damage. We might even realize that damage has already been caused. So that's one way. Whenever we're dealing with introductions of these organisms, even if we think we know a lot about how it works, you can still make a mistake. But in these, in something like, when it comes to some of these fungal biologies, we really don't know that much about how they're behaving ecologically. So it's easier for us to stumble into that trap unwittingly.
So you're saying if we're not cautious, if we don't take measured steps, it could lead to bigger problems.
Potentially.
Yeah. Next question is from, they don't give their name here. They ask, would Peter McCoy, who's the founder of Radical Mycology, believe that fungi could possibly be trained to eat cancer cells and tumors? Oh, that's an interesting question.
I've never heard of anyone investigating that possibility. I think it would be quite hard to arrange that because you have to encourage this fungus to be growing within your bodily tissues. And if it was growing within your bodily tissues and eating cancer cells, then it's hard to imagine it wouldn't also, if there was a fungus that could be trained to eat cancer cells, which is a form of flesh, but I haven't heard of any fungus that does that in this way, that it wouldn't also just eat your non-cancerous cells. So I think it's maybe less likely that we'll find a solution that way, and more likely that we'll find fungal solutions to cancers through these fungal anti-cancer compounds that many species produce and which are under investigation already, which have anti-tumor, anti-cancer properties, and also help to upregulate our own body's endogenous anti-cancer fighting mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's a sort of a technical question around soil from Taya. She says, can I use the mycelium circles to offer information to my soil biome with old growth soils, or ION biome, an antidote for glyphosate developed by Dr. Zach Bush? How can I support greater balance and restoration to them?
So I'm not sure about the supplement because I haven't heard of it, and I'm not quite sure about the using the mycelial circles. I'm not sure if I understand what is meant, but there are lots of things that you can do to attend to the health of soil. And this is something that traditional cultivators have long known in many parts of the world, and which many organic biodynamic farmers are thinking about now. And usually it involves adding organic matter to the soil to add to carbon. So, well rotted organic matter, which supports a healthy microbial ecosystem, provides bulk and mass in which these soil populations can live, and starts to undo some of the damage we've done, which is essentially mining carbon and nutrients from the soil.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Deborah. She says, "Thank you for your wonderful work and sharing it with us. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how we might proceed helping our children understand the interconnected nature of their world rather than the centralized perspectives you speak of. What can we do as educators and parents to start shifting the next generation's perspective?" Great question.
So I think this is really important, and perhaps it's best thought about by investigating the ways that we form their perceptions in the first place. It's a mixture of stories and guiding experiences, I suppose. And so maybe we could audit the stories that we tell, the ways that we explain, the kind of explanations that we offer about how the living world operates. And then in experiences, by feeding curiosity, by encouraging curiosity into how these organisms relate to each other, that could be something, rather than to encourage curiosity about an organism in isolation by itself, to encourage curiosity towards the relationships formed between different organisms, and to encourage experiences of the living world which allow children to connect to organisms that aren't other humans. And I think that's a really big one. And so many young people live and grow up without much connection to non-human organisms around them. And so to encourage that, to support that, to feed that, I think would help to nourish a curiosity about these organisms and how they relate to each other.
Mm-hmm. There's a question again from an anonymous person asking, is there a relationship between fungus and bees? Do you have any recommendations for helping bees through fungus? How might this be done? Thanks. Of course, you touched on this in your book.
Yes, so the work of Paul Stamets is very relevant here. And Paul's done some amazing research with a team at Washington State University. And working off an intuition that Paul had that these antiviral compounds produced by certain fungi might help to alleviate colony collapse disorder in honeybees. And colony collapse disorder is a complex syndrome. One of the things that happens is that bees' immune systems are weakened and they succumb to viruses, a range of viruses. And Paul's found that indeed it's true that the extracts from certain mushrooms, certain fungi, they can alleviate colony collapse disorder. And so it's a really exciting finding, a major finding. And he's now actively working on ways to try and roll out these bee extracts to support bee health around the world. So I suggest looking at Paul's work on this if you want to know more.
That's Paul Stamets. Now you've known him since you were young. Was he a friend of your parents?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he's been a great fungal inspiration.
Right. And your descriptions of him in your book are quite paint the character of who he is, and he's quite a big celebrity in this world, isn't he?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I had written down a quote that you wrote about Paul Stamets, and I'll read it out if I can because I thought it was hilarious. So here's Merlin writing on Paul Stamets. He says, "Viral storms of unprecedented proportions threaten global food security. Critical pollinators struggle on under grave threat from the virus-bearing parasites, poised to inflict global famine. The future of the world hangs in the balance. But wait, is that? Yes. Once again, fungi come to the rescue with the help of their human accomplice, Stamets. He's got this kind of superhero persona, hey?
Yeah, I was teasing gently this whole Paul featured in he spoke to the Star Trek team, and the recent series of Star Trek Discovery had an astromycologist hero called Lieutenant Paul Stamets, who was working to use fungi to save humanity, fighting against a series of terminal threats. And so I was just drawing this parallel between these astromycologists, sci-fi heroes, and Paul himself. So
That's cool. I'm a Star Trek fan myself. Next question we have is from Sharon. She says, "Thanks, Merlin, for offering this wonderful talk of your fascinating and useful work. The biggest question we are facing right now is how can we take the plastic out of our oceans? Can fungi help us, or can we help them deal with this mess? Sincerely, Sharon."
And there are some types of fungus that can digest some types of plastic. I haven't heard of any marine fungi digesting plastic, although it's not inconceivable they could. But the microplastics in the ocean is such a big problem because they're so dispersed. So it seems that, however it's done, some kind of centralizing, some kind of concentrating of these particles is going to be required before we can address them, to treat them. So I'm not sure what the best way to go is. It seems to me that to stop the release of these plastic into the ocean in the first place would be a good place to begin, because that's quite within our power to do. To then go about extracting it from the ocean is a whole other a major challenge. And yeah, I haven't heard of anyone using fungi for this problem.
There's another question along those lines from Jamie, who says, "Since fungi can break down hydrocarbons, could we eventually use mycelial networks on a larger scale to break down large garbage sites as a biological waste disposal system so that we no longer have landfill, but a regenerated soil to reclaim healthy land?"
Yeah, so microremediation isn't a simple fix, because you can show that fungi can digest certain things in a laboratory environment, but then when you release this fungus into a contaminated ecosystem, there's so many other organisms there doing their thing. And the idea that this fungal strain would be able to hustle effectively in the site and to remediate the site by itself is a little naive. So one of the difficulties is to work out how to introduce these fungi in such a way that they can both thrive and be metabolically active enough to deal with this pollutant. And so when it comes to landfills, actually some plastic digesting fungi have been isolated from landfills, because perhaps these landfills create the conditions for new strains of fungi to come into being, and to strains to adapt and have new metabolic faculties. So it may actually be that landfills are a place that we would actually go to look for fungal strains that we can then apply to other parts of the waste stream. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to know what will happen to the landfills in the long term. I mean, they will self-select for organisms that can live there, thrive there, and do their thing. It just it would take a long time for them to. It depends on the kind of landfill, of course. If you have a radioactive waste pit, then it's going to be different conditions from a non-radioactive one. So yeah, a big question, but I would say that Anthos would be a place that we could start looking for useful fungal strains.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one more question here, and this one is from Chris. He asks, what about morphic resonance, your father, Rupert Sheldrake's theory, as an explanation for the functioning of fungal networks?
That's a big one. Well, my father's hypothesis of morphic resonance is something that would explain, that would help to understand the operation of the whole universe. I mean, it's a general physical principle, at least that's what he's proposing. And so if it guides the crystallization of chemical compounds, if it guides the behavior of all organisms, then definitely it would also guide the behavior and the evolution of fungi too. Quite how this would happen is a that's a big conversation to have, right. Perhaps for another time.
Right, yes. Before we close, I'm very curious to ask you what is it that you're working on right now? What are your current projects?
At the moment, I'm in a cyclone of book publicity. So actually, I haven't had time to really kick off a whole new project. I'm interested in picking up doing some research on the electrical signaling within fungal networks. That's what I'm currently thinking about doing next. And more writing projects and more research. Yeah.
Great. I'm excited that you've got more writing projects because really, for anybody that hasn't read the book, Merlin is a really fantastic writer. He's poetic and paints a beautiful picture. It's easy to read if anybody's scared of diving into a book like this because they feel it might be too scientific. Please don't be scared. It's a wonderfully woven story and easily accessible and entertaining as well as informative and expansive. Last question. What do you feel, Merlin, is the future of mycology today? What needs the most attention?
A lot of basic work needs to be done on the behavior of mycelial networks, how they signal to themselves, how do they coordinate their behavior, how did they pass information around themselves, and how does information pass between one mycelial network and another fungus, or between one fungus and a plant. And so a lot of basic biological work needs to be done, physiological work. And that will help us to understand a lot about fungal lives. And then there's many questions about fungal applications, new fungal medicines. There's a lot of exploration to be done there. The remediation technologies, fungal research into building materials, leather-like fabrics or bricks that you can build structures from. And this is a lot of research is happening into these areas already, but this has a potential to really transform human lives. Yeah, so a mixture of basic biology, a basic understanding without particular outcomes in mind, and this applied branch. But really, it's a really big question because in fungal biology, really, you don't have to go very far before you hit a load of unanswered questions, even just as far as how they grow, how do hyphal tips, how they expand. We don't really understand the basic mechanics of their growth process. How do the it's such a fundamental part of their lives, and yet it remains so little understood.
Okay. Merlin, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and speaking to our audience. And congratulations on your first book and the success of it. It's a wonderful book, and looking forward to seeing your work in the future and possibly connecting again. A reminder to everybody that Banyan is open 11 to 7 every day at our brick and mortar location in Kitsilano and Vancouver. And if you'd like to order anything online, you can go to banyan.com, BANYEN.com. Thanks again, Merlin Sheldrake, and wishing everyone a great day.
Thank you.